The Wars of the Roses. The Wars of the Roses were a series of civil wars in English history. It was during the medieval era, and we can see this here depicted in this photograph on the first slide, or it's a painting. It's by Richard Burchett. It is showing Edward IV on the left-hand side right here. He is trying to pursue the Lancastrian forces who are fleeing into his sanctuary. So this kind of sets the stage for, the level of rivalry between these people who are somehow related. It is often referred to as the Cousins' War. So it didn't really impact the average English citizen at the time. It was more or less a war between the nobility. So, what were the Wars of the Roses? They were a series of battles that divided England's nobility throughout 1455 to 1487. This was not solely due to the loss of hope in Henry VI. That did not help their anxiety and their uneasiness about his rule. He was a frail and weak king. He suffered through multiple bouts of psychosis and depression. His worsening mental state, as well as his inability to initially produce an heir, made way for other claimants to the throne to step forward. This is individuals such as the future Richard III, the future Henry VII, and Richard, Duke of York, who would go on to produce Edward V. However, that is contested, as Edward V was not crowned, as he was murdered in the Tower of London, or quote-unquote murdered. This made way for the House of Tudor, as everyone knows what the House of Tudor is, Henry VIII. So on the left here we have the York Rose, the House of York. It is a red rose. The white rose is the House of Lancaster. And after Henry VII won the Battle of Bosworth and became King of England, he combined the two after his marriage to a Yorkist woman. The boom of feudalism. So feudalism is essentially nobility above the crown. Prior to and during the Wars of the Roses, the nobles seemingly had more power than the crown. It was exacerbated by Henry VI's incapacity to rule and to govern. He was advised by nobles, counselors, and advisors. He seldom, if ever, made decisions on his own. Additionally, they kept people with royal blood from advising Henry VI. They did not let anyone who had actual claims to the throne to get anywhere near him. He granted the nobles more land than they needed in order to bolster their statuses. They would use these new lands to build up their own riches, subsequently draining the crown of money. The wealthy were beginning to become taxed less and less. It was becoming harder for the average English citizen who was working in a regular life. They weren't nobles. It was becoming very difficult for them to live. They were experiencing severe poverty and rising taxes, which caused a lot of unrest to the citizens of the time. A civil war is brewing. We can see on the left here, this is Henry VI. Everyone looked really sad in those paintings back then, but you can just imagine he's just not doing very well being king. So he, once again, was not a good king at all. I mean, we have to give him some credit because he probably tried his best. He was extremely religious and could not live up to his father, King Henry V. The loss of France in 1449 proved to be a detriment to his reign, if it could even get anywhere worse. It completely decimated the English morale and support for their country, as they felt that, what's the point in fighting? We're not going anywhere. The lords at Henry VI's court used his wealth to enrich themselves. This led to them garnering more land and riches than they were allotted, subsequently abusing a man who could not hold his own. People saw this and became doubtful that Henry would be able to run a prosperous England. And during this time, people did not want England to fall and did not want England to crumble. They wanted England to be prosperous and powerful. They wanted a strong leader. So they were fighting for England, I felt. They probably thought that. Even that led them to do some insane things. So now we begin to get into York versus Lancaster and, Henry Tudor. This is an artist rendition of a battle during the Wars of the Roses. We can see here the Lancastrians and the Yorks. This is the House of Lancaster, which is significantly less interesting than the House of York. However, Margaret of Anjou is very, very cool. She was the wife of Henry VI. That is not all she did. However, this is not a presentation about Margaret of Anjou, so bottom left is Henry VI. He was an unstable and weak king prior to and during the Wars of the Roses. Top right is Henry VII, the new Tudor king. He married Elizabeth of York, which combined the two houses of York and Lancaster, as Henry VII was of Lancastrian descent. Elizabeth's mother was Elizabeth of Woodville. They would later have 7 children, and he was a distant relative of King Edward III. The bottom right, we have Margaret of Anjou and King Henry VI's heir, Edward of Westminster, Prince of Wales. The House of York. So, farthest left we have Richard III, who is a real piece of work. Second to left is Richard Neville, the Earl of Salisbury and Warwick, aka the Kingmaker. Third to the left is Elizabeth of York. She married Henry VII, who's the first Tudor king, which once again combined the two houses. Far right is Richard, Duke of York. He had a claim to the throne as his great-grandfather was Edward III. He became Lord Protector of England while Henry VI was in a coma after suffering a psychotic break. On the bottom left, we have King Edward IV. He was a Yorkist king who claimed the throne on 2 separate occasions. His first stint as king of England was after the Lancasters were defeated during the Battle of Northampton. Henry VI was then restored to the throne in 1470 after a plot by the infamous Richard Neville. This plan was endorsed by the French king at the time, Louis XI, who was Margaret of Anjou's cousin. So, of course, he wanted Margaret to become queen again and her husband to become king. This pressure led to Edward IV to flee to Flanders until 1471, when he made his tentative return, as Henry VI was doing a pretty horrible job at being king once again. Who could have thought? After King Edward IV's death in 1483 at the young age of 40, his son Edward V was supposed to claim the throne. However, he and his brother were taken prisoner in the Tower of London in 1483. By who else but Richard III. The new young king and his brother were mysteriously murdered. In quotes, mysteriously. Many people believe Richard III had them killed, as he was the direct beneficiary of their deaths. As a new king arose, King Richard III. At the bottom right, we have Elizabeth Woodville. Her family caused a rift with Edward IV. This led to Edward IV having to literally run for his life during the Lincolnshire Rebellion. Another very, very cool woman. Just full of insanely cool women. So some notable battles. The thing about the Wars of the Roses is it was not a continual fight. They had a bunch of little battles scattered around the country. That's why it's called the Wars of the Roses and not the War of the Roses. So on this picture here, though, is at the Battle of Bosworth Field, which 1485. It is not a painting. I think it's a digital picture painting, but it is of Henry VII being crowned after the defeat of Richard III, as we can see here. So, in 1453, Margaret of Anjou gave birth to a long-awaited child. This seemed to quell worries about the future for succession. However, later that year, Henry VI fell into a coma that lasted into December of that same year. During this time, the nobility became more hostile to each other and began fighting over who should claim the lands. On the 27th of March, 1454, Richard, Duke of York, is deemed protector of the realm. This appeased him for a bit. However, he felt as though he was not getting admiration and recognition he believed he warranted. Richard did have a claim to the throne, albeit a very distant claim, through his mother. His sense of entitlement consequently led to the first battle of the Wars of the Roses, which was the Battle of St. Albans. There were 2 battles of St. Albans, but the first one occurred in 1455 and the second one in 1461. We have the Battle of Towton, which was one of the deadliest battles ever fought on English soil. This was such a disastrous defeat for the House of Lancaster that they had to spend 3 years regaining their numbers in the military to even begin fighting again. Upwards of 28,000 soldiers were killed in this single battle. that occurred in 1461. The Battle of Tewkesbury, it was in 1471. The Battle of Barnet was also in 1471, but later that year. And the Battle of Bosworth Field concluded the Wars of the Roses, and that was when Richard III was defeated by the new king, Henry VII, starting the Tudor reign. Plots, assassinations, and depositions. So, Richard Neville, the 16th Earl of Warwick, was an extremely powerful and wealthy English nobleman. He is dubbed the insanely cool name of the Kingmaker. The Second Battle of St. Albans resulted in the Lancastrians having a slight advantage over the Yorkists. Margaret of Anjou and Henry VI fled out of harm's way alongside their son. Consequently, Warwick saw this and immediately made a move. He took Richard, Duke of York's son, to London and proclaimed him as the new King Edward IV, instilling the House of York to the throne. Richard III accused William Hastings of treason, so he was pretty screwed. No one really survives being tried for treason in the 1400s, especially by a king, and a king such as Richard III. So William Hastings, the first Baron of Hastings, was executed. Propaganda was very rampant throughout this time as well. They wanted people to be unsure in the leadership that the crown had, and they wanted people to know that Henry VI was an unfit ruler. We have The Princess in the Tower, which was a medieval murder mystery. It's a very controversial topic. Some people think that Richard III definitely had his two nephews murdered in the Tower of London. However, in the 17th century, some workers discovered a small box containing 2 child skeletons. Of course, people are going to assume, like, hey, these little skeletons are probably the Princess in the Tower. But we probably will never know, because after these were removed from the Tower of London, they were never DNA tested. Queen Elizabeth II declined over and over again to DNA test the bones. She believed it would cause a lot of headaches, especially if they weren't the princes in the tower and they were totally, completely different bones. So they just did not do it. But now that King Charles is in power, we might see the DNA testing get done as he's more open to that type of thing. However, people do believe that King Richard III did it, and I personally also believe that, because he is the one that benefited directly as after their deaths, he became king. This changed England significantly. It showed that monarchs could come from anywhere and that birthright was not the end-all be-all. Richard III's rise to the throne. If you had a smallish rocklet of royal blood and were able to garner enough supporters, you could set your sights on becoming the King of England as well. And this is shown with Henry VII, who had the smallest claim to the crown and still managed to become King of England after the Wars of the Roses. This ended years of bloody civil war. The wars finally ceased. The medieval era had finally closed, which lasted from about 500 AD to about 1500 AD, so about 1,000 years. It reinstated law and order to England. Feudalism began to fall, nobility was beginning to get back into check, and the houses of York and Lancaster were finally united under the House of Tudor. This is something I thought would be pretty neat to share. This is a king's burial. So in 2012, the remains of Richard III were discovered. After his death at the Battle of Bosworth Field, his corpse was abused and, rightfully so. I'm not going to say rightfully so, but he was a pretty horrible person and people got really mad at him. So they took it out on his corpse and they put him in a random shallow grave, and his remains were missing for centuries until 2012. In 2012, a woman by the name of Philippa Langley made an amazing discovery. After countless hours of research on Richard III, she made the assumption that the medieval king was buried under a parking lot. Ironically, the parking lot had the letter R on the space, which indicates reserved, which also could mean, Richard, he was telling everyone, hey, I'm right here. His remains were removed, DNA tested, and given a proper king's burial. His coffin was constructed by a very distant relative of his. He now lies in Leicester